Welcome back to Unfiltered HR. I am Jen Straight with Complete Payroll.
Emily Martin from Ally HR Partners.
And today we are at Lloyd Taco Factory on Hurdle. And I'm starting to smell all the food. So we're right before they open. And they're getting cooking. So my stomach, if you hear it on the mic, it's going to be like, does it sound like a T-Rex? So I'm sorry. Anyways, thank you for listening to all of that. We're going to jump in. Today we're going to talk about
exempt versus non-exempt status.
Fun stuff.
Yeah, we're getting real fun here.
But it's a common question. Which
commonly misunderstood. Yeah.
Exactly. And that brings us to a great point, and we usually end our videos with this, but we want to talk about what you have questions about. So the only way we'll know that is if you reach out and let us know. So we take the common questions and what people are reaching out to us about or misunderstanding, and we're going to make a video and kind of try to make it easier for you. So please
help us make these as helpful to you as possible. We try to do that anyway, but more feedback the better, for sure.
And also, if you would like to host us, please reach out to us, because we're always looking for places to do our videos.
Yes.
And that's usually how we end the video, but we're going to start it that way. We're going to flip things upside down. All right, so let's dive into it.
All right, so exempt versus non-exempt status. So this basically determines how you pay your employees, which is kind of regulated mostly at the federal level, but New York State has its own special rules as well. So exempt, let's first of all talk about what this means, right? What is exempt? What is non-exempt? So basically what exempt is referring to is the fact that those employees in those positions are exempt from needing to be paid overtime if they work over 40 hours in a work week. And then non-exempt means that the employees are not exempt, double negative, just to make it extra fun.
Just to make it a little interesting.
From being paid overtime. So exempt means you don't have to pay overtime basically, and non-exempt means that you do have to pay overtime for hours worked over 40 in a work week. Generally, most positions, the best default is to go non-exempt, and the government really wants people to be non-exempt despite what employees usually want. But typically non-exempt is the default category. So typically, something that's misunderstood is typically, non-exempt employees are paid hourly, and they should be paid hourly. And exempt is associated with salaried payment, right? That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but that is a good just general rule of thumb if you're trying to keep it simple. But generally, you would pay non-exempt employees on an hourly basis, so you can track the number of hours they worked. So if they work over 40, you can pay them overtime. Whereas exempt, you're safer paying salary because you don't have to pay overtime anyway, so you just pay them the same regardless of how much they work. So those are really the two differences between them. So the big question really is, how do you know when you can pay someone exempt versus non-exempt, right? This is the most commonly misunderstood thing I think that I come across with my clients when I'm doing audits on their payroll practices or wage and hour practices. So let's get into that. So like I said, basically non-exempt is the most common category, and if you're uncertain at all, you certainly should default to that non-exempt status, pay the people hourly, pay them overtime if they work over 40, and track their hours. If you want to pay someone exempt or on a salaried basis where you don't have to pay overtime, there's a two-part test to that, Jen.
Let's talk about the two-part test.
All right.
We're going to give you a test here.
The first part of that test is the minimum wage test. So as we all know, there's minimum wages for hourly staff, keeps going up. There's also a minimum wage, though, for salaried staff or exempt staff. There is a federal minimum wage, just like hourly, but there is also a state governed minimum wage for exempt employees in New York State. And unfortunately, you could probably guess this, it's a lot higher than the federal.
That's so weird. In New York State?
Yes. And unfortunately, it keeps going up every year. So to pass that first, most kind of easy black and white part of that exempt status test, an employee right now in 2022, this just went up, an employee needs to be paid the equivalent of $990 a week in a salary, which equates to about $51,480 a year. So if you have employees now that are not making at least that much money, and you're paying them on a salaried basis and they're not getting overtime, right there, that's your first red flag, okay? Again, this is specific to New York State, and there are like special categories of exemptions that don't require this minimum salary amount, but most positions that you would have in your company would require this.
And we'll put a graphic on those exemptions. Well, I hate to use that word, but with this.
Exceptions,
And the exceptions.
Yeah.
And this is good to note that this is talking about full-time. So if you have part-time, that's a whole nother set of fun rules.
Yeah, could possibly rules, yeah. So these are general guidelines, but again, if you're uncertain at all, let's assess everything on an individual basis.
Yeah.
So again, the first part of the test to be exempt, salaried, no overtime, is they have to make at least $990 a week. So right off the bat, if someone's not making that, then they should not be exempt. All right? The second part of the test, Jen, which is much commonly less known and understood, is the position has to meet a duties test. Yeah, I said duty, but duties
I'm an
test.
adult and I'm not gonna laugh.
So basically what this is referring to is, does the position have certain responsibility levels and decision-making levels that rise it to the level of what the government basically says can be exempt, salaried, not eligible for overtime, right? So there are several categories of exemption out there. If you Google it, you'll find that. But the two most common and the two we're going to talk about is the executive exemption category and the administrative. Mm-hmm. Those are the two most common. 99% of positions you probably have in your company would fall into that if they were exempt. So we're just going to focus on those today. So what that means is that basically to be in the executive exemption category, a person needs to have 2 or more employees reporting to them, and they need to really have actual like firing and hiring decision-making ability over those employees. So if you have someone who's in a position where they actually are doing that, not just it's written in a job description, but not real life, and they meet that minimum salary amount, then they can safely be categorized as exempt and be paid salaried without the overtime. Okay, so that's the first category, probably the easiest category. Most managers or directors that have employees report to them would safely fit in there. The other category is the administrative exemption, and this is a little bit more gray and wishy-washy, and probably the number one area where employees are misclassified. A lot of people just kind of like dump positions into this category and assume that it's safely exempt, but they can get in a lot of trouble by doing that, right? So this category, really the duties test is about, is the person making significant business decisions, decisions using a lot of independent judgment and discretion, which means they're not just following a guide or like protocol set by the business, right? So HR positions that are higher level would fit into this category because you're making decisions about hiring and firing, or different things that could have really big implications for the business. But a good example of something that doesn't fall into this that you might think would fall into this, Jen, is like mortgage loan officers or people of that type, right? A lot of times the government comes in and says those are not exemption eligible because although they're making decisions and they're approving loans for maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, they're using a really specific protocol that the business put in place to do that, so there isn't that independent judgment and discretion. Okay. So that just gives you an idea of the nuance, basically, of this category. So be careful if you're considering putting people in this exemption category.
Now, if you have a salaried position, is there anything that qualifies where you're salaried position and you get paid like an overtime or like out based on the hours? Because I've had some questions about that where I'm paying this employee a salary, we're going to ask them to come in on a Saturday for, it could be a community event or it could be something that they need them to come into and we want to pay them extra. Is that mandatory? How does that work? Can you make them basically work?
Sure. If someone is safely exempt, whether they're, and paid salaried, you do not need to pay them additional pay for hours worked over what their normal work schedule is, right? There are circumstances where you can pay someone on a salaried basis, but they're considered non-exempt. And that would just mean if they ever work over 40 or over what your stated number of hours is for that agreement for that salary, then you would still need to pay overtime and be tracking their hours. So there is some creativity involved, and we certainly work with clients all the time on these situations if they want to pay salary, but the person can't be exempt for the duties test reason. But it is a case-by-case basis, Jen, and that's a good point. Like, we're trying to provide you with as much general, like most situation applicable knowledge in this video. But if you have questions or are concerned at all, there is a lot of nuance and flexibility to some of this stuff.
And I have some, not only business owners, but employees reaching out saying, I make this salary, can they make me come in on Saturday?
Yeah.
And that's a very, I can't answer that in general because you have to know.
It's circumstantial, yeah.
But it is. Can business owners if your salary, can they make you come in on a Saturday?
Yeah.
They
can, yeah, pretty much.
Right.
Yeah. But and then it gets into employee relations and retention and satisfaction and all those things.
Sure.
So but yeah, again, the rule of thumb is default to non-exempt, default to paying overtime unless you're absolutely sure. But remember, if someone is going to be considered exempt and not eligible for overtime, they have to pass both that minimum salary test and that duties test. And we will have resources available for some of this stuff afterwards if you want to reach out and get a checklist of the duties test and that kind of thing.
And just overtime in general, it's a good resource. Emily's a good resource to have because there's different overtime rules too. So if you're paying 1.5 times, or if you have multiple jobs with multiple rates, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah, let's do a video on that sometime.
We will. The overtime, what you need to pay the overtime, if they have different rates for different jobs that they're working, it's not just 1.5 times of that job they happen to be working that day. So that's something that a lot of people don't know, but it's good to talk to Emily, and this is why it's so hard to answer general questions, is because you have to take a deep dive. Well, how many jobs do they have? What is the average pay? All of that. So that's something that you would want to reach Emily.
Yeah, so hopefully this information was just helpful in giving you an idea of what some of the nuance might be or risks might be. And if you have questions or situations you're kind of uncertain about, definitely encourage you to reach out. And that's a big takeaway from this video as well, not just basically understanding what those things are, what those exemptions are, what the definitions are, what the requirements are, but that you really need to reach out if you're uncertain, because unfortunately now at the federal level, not just the state level, audits of these things are becoming more and more random, and the government's looking for problems and misclassifications. And if you do misclassify someone and didn't pay them overtime, they could go back in some cases up to 6 years and tell you they owe people overtime, and then there would be fines on top of that potentially and penalties. So it's serious stuff. It can cost you a lot of money. So definitely want to get it right. And
I think that we're not saying that to scare you, because I think people now they're like, let's start doing the right thing. Not that you were intentionally doing the wrong thing, but let's start looking at this now in a different way and not look back. But it's going to be better if you do go through that. So Emily and I have had a client together that we went back and corrected some of the overtime. And that looks a lot better if you're audited, that you try to do the right good efforts, and to the employees. So it's important, and don't be afraid to kind of dive into those things. But that's why it's so good to have a timekeeping system, and not just even if people are paid salary, just to have that electronic timekeeping system in place.
Yeah, for sure.
Because we're always going back to records. Yeah.
Documentation.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So if you have questions, reach out. Again, not to overwhelm you, but kind of to just make you aware of some nuance that's out there, so you can start to look at your business and do things better, so that you don't get caught off guard later.
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to save you time and money in the long run. And if you have any other questions, content suggestions, please let us know. We want to make these as relevant to you as possible. Not what we necessarily think is relevant, but what you think is relevant. So please reach out to us for content suggestions. I know we already talked about this, but or if you would like to host us, we would love to be there.
Wonder where we'll be next time.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. We'll see. All right. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.